Welcome to the third edition of the Expansive webinar series. My name is Rene Velasquez. I lead the global carbon team at Expansive Markets CBL, and I've got the great privilege today of moderating today's panel in what will surely be a riveting conversation with global experts. A few housekeeping remarks just before we get underway. Given the webinar format and due to the high number of registrants, all attendees are muted by default, but we do encourage you to interact with us and address your questions by posting in the questions section featured in your Zoom webinar panel. The organizers will be monitoring your questions throughout the event, and we will of course do our best to address any and as many of them as possible. Please note that this event is being recorded and the link to the recording will be made available shortly after the event. So let's begin. To set the scene, I really want to focus on the role of nature-based solutions and really focus specifically on how ecosystems really across the globe are vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and as are the communities that depend on them. The protection of these ecosystems from further degradation offers a key pathway effectively here, and we view nature-based solutions just as that, as solutions to help to keep carbon from entering the atmosphere. Nature-based solutions are increasingly prominent in climate change policy as well as finance, as well as in the carbon markets more broadly, and really represent, quite frankly, the only solution with a proven track record to help reduce emissions on a gigaton scale. Now, over the last few years, within the VCM in particular, MBS has become the fastest growing segment, driven in large part by demand. Corporate buyers have gravitated towards MBS not only because of the climate-related benefits of protecting the natural carbon sinks, but often because of the co-benefits that are associated with them. And so today, we will discuss the important role of MBS in mitigating climate change and hear from market experts really on the intersection of the VCM and compliance markets as a result of the Paris Agreement. And I'm very lucky today to be joined by some of the preeminent minds really in our industry, and I'd like to introduce them and kick today's conversation off. Panelists, I'd invite you to please turn on your cameras. And so without further ado, let me introduce our panel. With me today, we have Dirk Forrister, President and CEO of the International Emissions Trading Association, or IETA. We have Edward Rumsey, Managing Partner from Permian Global, and Kelley Kizzier, Fellow at the Bezos Earth Fund. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it. Great. So let's kick off today's conversation, and really it is what it is, a conversation with experts, and we really love to hear your thoughts. Now, Dirk, I might turn to you just first. You know, in the introduction, in that brief kind of introduction segue, I mentioned the importance of nature-based solutions, but also this intersection of MBS with regards to the Paris Agreement. I think you have a very fortunate vantage point, really, not only as the oldest statesman of our panel and of our market, but you effectively are the voice of our industry, representing really the International Emissions Association and really Trading Association, and you're involved and present within many fora, in particular at the UNFCCC. How do you see this kind of intersection developing? There's a number of different kind of recent media articles specifically focusing on things such as moratoriums, and countries are effectively trying to grapple with this kind of transition under the Paris Agreement. Can you give us some thoughts just in terms of what you're seeing at the moment?
Sure. I'm happy to give my view, Rene, and thanks again for the invitation to join today. One of the great achievements of the Paris Agreement was this acknowledgement that getting to the Paris temperature goals was going to require getting to net zero emissions. And I think a lot of people maybe only hear the zero part and forget about the net part, but certainly if you're in the business of planning a transition and thinking about a much safer climate, you're thinking about what the net means and how to make it real and how to make it something that is going to deliver the goods, so to speak, for protecting the environment. And to us, the net is all about cooperation. It's about cross-sectoral cooperation. It's about bringing in the role of nature to compensate for any remaining emissions that are in the system over the long term. But it's also about cooperation across borders, because not every country is blessed with the same potential for nature-based solutions, or even for that matter, technological sequestration as we know it today. So in that sense, Article 6 is probably the most important connective tissue of the whole Paris Agreement. If it wasn't there, you wouldn't achieve the goals in many, many countries, because you simply don't have the same options. Where we are on Article 6 is kind of, I feel like we're riding a wave a bit of the success in Glasgow and getting the basic rule book agreed for how the international accounting is going to work for countries. You could say that in some senses we're at a dog caught the car moment in terms of countries that want to use Article 6, because they can't blame the UN anymore for intransigence or inability to get agreement. Now it's all about how you use it. There are rules, more bits that will need to be elaborated over time. But really, the game now, I think, is for each country to decide what their strategy is for using it. That can be a wait and see for some countries, or it can be get involved early so that you attract investment and accelerate your own pathway to net zero. I'm impressed at what Japan has been doing of building out supply lines, in a sense of having a set of countries that it cooperates with. They haven't done a huge amount of trade yet, but they've got government to government understanding about how they're going to cooperate. There are other countries that are looking at doing a similar thing. You mentioned moratoria. I don't personally think that I think it's a very strong word, and I don't think I haven't actually seen a government impose something that's stamped moratoria. I think instead they're trying to get their act together. They're taking a pause. I've asked them directly, is it a moratoria or is it a pause? It's a pause while they determine what their national strategy is going to be. They want to make sure that they've got enough mitigation to meet their own potential or their own NDC. But for many of them, they've got enough to sell along the pathway and attract investment early again, so that they're in a better position to deliver a net zero commitment on time or even early. So I think we're in a very creative period now where countries think about how they're going to engage. And then the corporates kind of fall in line behind that. Once the country has a plan, you're going to know what you're doing. I'm happy to talk more about this, but I want to give Kelley and Ed a chance to speak a bit. So I'll
get a few words in.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's great. Like, look, really appreciate those insights, and specifically the point that you made around this, the kind of the wording, right? The moratorium piece. I think certainly, as it's been received in the media and by some participants in the VCM, it's been viewed as, maybe this is a really significant component that effectively throttles the supply piece. But I think the pragmatists amongst us believe exactly what you've just elaborated on, right? Which is, hey, this is effectively a pause. Effectively, governments are trying to figure out what is the best path forward for them and for how they effectively interoperate with other governments under Article 6, but also with regards to the VCM piece. So maybe that's a good sort of transition. Kelley, if I could just transition to you. Obviously, in your previous roles, you were fairly influential in helping to effectively draft the Article 6 language. And for those that don't know, Kelley was a negotiator for the European Commission at the UNFCCC and was heavily involved in the design, really, of the rule books and Article 6 language. Kelley, how do you see it as specifically as it relates to the nature-based component, right? So Dirk kind of talked about the Japan piece and how this kind of relationships with different governments, but on the nature-based side, specifically looking at it from the lens of forest-based countries along the equatorial belt, really, how do you see their kind of trajectory here in terms of how they're valuing the forests and how they're accounting for that, and how that kind of interrelates within the context of the VCM in particular?
Yeah, I'll back up a little bit, because I think, Dirk touched on this, but I think what happened in Glasgow is it was a really important signal. I think people were starting to be of the impression that we weren't going to be able to agree Article 6 rules. And that's important for all of the carbon market, not specific to nature-based solutions and not specific to the voluntary carbon market. And I think what we saw in Glasgow was that when we had real political will. And the timing, just to highlight this, the timing is really important. You know, this is really when we saw the United States come back to the negotiations after a hiatus in full. And you know, it was cooperation among all countries, but that political strength of the Kerry team really helped us get it over the line. So I think it's an important signal in general. We are able to agree these rules. This is not impossible. This is not too complicated. And that in itself, I think, is the main thing that came out of Glasgow. Obviously, those rules provided a lot of clarity in the context of compliance markets, in terms of accounting, transparency, baselines, additionality, commitment period length. The Article 6 rules also acknowledge the existence of a voluntary carbon market. Of course, it's couched in UN language, so you're never going to find the words voluntary carbon market in there. But this, you know, other purposes or other mitigation purposes is a reference to voluntary carbon markets. And I think because of the growth and the importance of that as a way to provide private sector capital, we saw that highlighted more than we ever have in the international. Unfortunately, the rules also leave open the question of corresponding adjustment in the context of the voluntary carbon market. And I think that's what countries are grappling with right now, right? The way that the rules are written is it is possible, but not required for countries to do a corresponding adjustment for the voluntary carbon market. And that's going to be really important in the context of nature-based solutions, which is the biggest upswing we see in the voluntary carbon market. And what we've seen is other major initiatives, sort of private sector NGO initiatives, come in to address those remaining questions on the governance of the voluntary carbon market. So you've got the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, the VCMI, which is trying to address the issue of claims. What can a company claim on the back of investment in voluntary carbon credits? And that's in a road testing phase where they're road testing the practicality of that guidance with companies. And then for the issue of quality, what is high quality? What is high integrity? We have the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. IETA, Dirk serves as a part of the secretariat for that. I'm on the board, along with a lot of other, sort of NGOs, people from the market sector, Indigenous people, and local community representatives, and representatives from business and the standard setting bodies. And right now, we have this entire assessment framework and assessment procedure in the ICBCM out for public consultation. And I would really encourage everyone here listening to really, really participate in that public consultation, because it's so important that we get expertise, not just from the, typical carbon market nerds, but from across the market, so that we can make that work, because we have to step in and sort of fill that gap that was left in the Article 6 rules. I think those kind of signals will be hugely important to the countries you're talking about, the countries that are generating nature-based solution credits, because they also want guidance in terms of what, where the demand is going to come from, what conditions the demand is going to have on it, and, to be able to land an appropriate price signal, right? The price is going to be related to those conditions. And I think that's going to be massively important. So those kind of initiatives that really have a center of gravity, like the Integrity Council, are going to be massive.
Yeah, and I think I'll piggyback off what you've just said, and thank you for that. I think it is really important that it's not just, and I'll paraphrase you, the carbon nerds that chime in here. Really, we have this opportunity as a collective, to help to shape really this body, right, and the path forward for the voluntary carbon market. And it's really important in terms of, as you said, from the integrity and qualitative piece in terms of how this market moves forward. I think, Ed, you've been unusually quiet, so let's bring you in. And so I think, you've heard what Dirk and Kelley have kind of discussed here, right, around this kind of certainly this watershed moment that was COP and the Article 6 rulebook, which wasn't a given, and we were very, very glad to see being resolved. But you, I think, have a unique perspective here on the panel, representing one of the largest project developers in the world, and really have decades of expertise of on the ground experience in helping to stand up and develop and implement these projects, as well as maintain the high integrity of the projects that you've developed. Can you give us your perspective on how these sort of markets collide?
Yeah, absolutely, Ren, and thanks for asking us to come and speak today. And I'd also just like to thank you quickly for not asking me to go after Dirk. We left a really joke about a pause coming into a bear market, which is obviously a terrible joke, but I couldn't help myself touching on it. Yeah, no, it's great. I'd like to revert back. This is going to seem like a bit of a sort of futile point, but rocking all the way back to 2018 and that paper that everyone saw that really coined the term nature-based solutions. So the Bronson Grid Conservation International Gang, 3% of public climate finance is going on nature-based solutions, whilst representing 37% of the mitigation opportunity or 30% of the cost-efficient mitigation opportunity. Right. So not enough public finance going into this space. Now, fast forward to where we are now, 2022, I believe that number is now at around about 7 or 8% of public finance going on nature-based solutions. So it's still a very small fraction of public climate finance. Now, if we look at what's going to drive demand for countries to purchase mitigation outcomes within the constructs of the Paris Agreement under Article 6, particularly 6.2, I'm thinking about here, there's a number of countries that have incorporated market-based measures within their strategies. The rules are now defined. We're starting to see some early action, but really any serious demand, I would imagine, is going to come from when countries start to review global stock take. Perhaps they've missed their individual targets. Maybe they have to increase ambition. Perhaps they're not. We're in agreement that we need to review our targets. We're not aligned with Paris temperature targets, et cetera, et cetera. That to me isn't really embodying the urgency or the immediacy of the requirement in terms of the situation we're in right now. So what that paper in 2018 did, it stemmed a lot of work, and then 2020 more work. Kelley alluded to the TSVCM and obviously the ISVCM, VCMI, etc. It really did mobilize the private sector in this space, which is a really important point to appreciate, because what we're trying to do is build an enabling environment which allows both foreign and domestic private investments in nature-based solutions, such that you can then create a market to trade those emission reductions. You want to make it attractive to the private sector. So how does that look when we're thinking about the construct of the Paris Agreement and potential for corresponding adjustments? Now, I mean, I'm quite happy to go into this in as little or as much technical detail as you like, but it's about, from my perspective, from our perspective, it'll be what exactly is a corresponding adjustment and what exactly is an offset, right? So a corresponding adjustment from one greenhouse gas inventory to another, okay? It's moving an emission reduction from one inventory to another. Exactly what it is. Now, an offset is an entity that's emitting something somewhere and then paying for an emission reduction that would not have otherwise happened somewhere else to compensate or neutralize that emission. Now, the act of offsetting does not require you to export a unit into another greenhouse gas inventory. It's as simple as that. It doesn't. You're offsetting, you're compensating a footprint by paying for an emission reduction. So we need to delve into this. We need to think about when corresponding adjustments are required, because if countries believe they are, and countries, which is at their prerogative, as they agreed in Glasgow, from a discretionary basis, can decide that they don't want to allow emission reductions to be exported, then what you're going to do, you're going to block private investment, domestic or otherwise.
Yeah, that's a really interesting kind of point. I'd like to kind of pick at that thread if I can here. The corresponding adjustment pathway is an interesting one as well that I'd like to kind of get perspective from the panelists on. I'll give you guys a free choice. Which one do you want to? Which rabbit hole do you want to go down? Dirk, you pick.
Well, I'll go down the rabbit hole just a second about at least my view of how the act of corresponding adjustment, like what does it actually mean?
Mm-hmm.
And as relates to the voluntary market. And my view of it is that a corresponding adjustment is something a government needs to do. So if a government is exporting units and another government is using those units, those need to be reported. And if those conditions are happening, frankly, I'm agnostic on whether it's a voluntary or a compliance market. The question is whether the user government is reporting it to the UN. And as Ed's describing, most of the, or maybe all of the voluntary carbon market at present is not being accounted by the quote unquote user side. Now, that might change in the future. I mentioned Japan earlier, and I think the Japan view is evolving in a way that there may be some voluntary commitments that frankly look a lot like compliance commitments in other jurisdictions. They're taken seriously. But you may have a situation where a volunteer, making emission reductions in Japan needs to augment those with carbon units that are purchased from abroad. They're going to get those corresponding adjustments and they're going to turn them into the government, and the government of Japan will report those. That's a sort of a souped up voluntary that's different than the way the voluntary market currently operates. And I don't know if other jurisdictions will do that or not, but I think it's a possibility that it would be they will have different flavors of voluntarism. It's not just one thing, but there'll be, some that are not covered by regimes and are doing this out of social, their own ethical obligations on serving their shareholders and their clients by showing that they're doing the right thing. And they may not need a corresponding adjustment. And I'd say that's the bulk of the voluntary market right now. Well, I think we in the market need to be open-minded that I see this as a pathway of possible convergence over time. But right now, I think they operate independently because there aren't that many compliance systems that recognize an international carbon credit. There are a few, and they're important because they.
Yeah, Kizzier, for example.
Corsia, exactly. Corsia is an excellent example of that, where adjustments will be made in the future. We will see corresponding adjustments there. But personally, I see that a bit more as a compliance system, right? But using voluntary market standards, right?
Exactly, and that's an interesting one. And kind of, if I could tie in the two kind of threads here in terms of. And I think Vera outlined this really eloquently in terms of the pathways that they kind of described around the corresponding adjustments side of things. In the case of the classical kind of 6.2 ITMO approach that you outlined at the beginning, Dirk, of your kind of your comments, obviously country to country is essentially requiring that netting, right? Those corresponding adjustments being made on both sides of that ledger, essentially. But in the Corsia example, it's an interesting one where essentially it's the selling country effectively making that corresponding adjustment into their ledger, so essentially saying we're exporting these units. But on the other side of the equation is not a country; it's an airline that's essentially purchasing these offsets for, as you mentioned, a compliance obligation as part of ICAO's mandate. And so that is one pathway. Then obviously the default pathway is not having corresponding adjustments, and effectively that goes to the claims piece around what Kelley intimated earlier around the VCMI and how we kind of define the legal language around what can be claimed. And then I think there will be obviously another pathway for certain corporates like you've just described, Dirk, that actually require or demand units that have corresponding adjustments. And that, I think it's fair to say, you're absolutely correct, has not yet really emerged. There is an expectation from market participants that there will be a premium attributable to units that have those corresponding adjustments, and certainly we've had those debates and discussions with market participants, certainly as it relates to some of our contracts, for example with the NGO, where the specs on that contract do not require corresponding adjustments, but they are deliverable at this point in time. So it's an interesting kind of trajectory in terms of how we're learning by doing and how we implement this moving forward. Kelley, do you care to comment and provide any kind of insights?
Yeah, just, this is a really sort of massive debate and an issue of divide in the voluntary carbon market. So I don't want to downplay that. I think we do need to get to an agreement on it. But just a couple of points of clarification. The Article 6 rules are clear that a corresponding adjustment is required for CORSIA. So that's not optional or a choice.
No, absolutely.
International mitigation purposes is, a term of art for CORSIA in the Article 6 rules, and a corresponding adjustment is required in that case. When it comes to how and whether a corresponding adjustment applies to voluntary commitments. I mean, we always say like voluntary carbon market or voluntary carbon credits. Really, that's not relevant because voluntary carbon credits are used in CORSIA and will be subject to a corresponding adjustment. I imagine if they were used by California, they are used by California right now, but not subject to international transfer because California only uses US generated credits. But if they were ever coming from another country, probably a corresponding adjustment would apply because it's in the context of a compliance target. It is about the commitment. And for voluntary commitments, I think Ed touched on it, Dirk touched on it. It is really about the claim. This is where the argument is coming down for people. What claim are you trying to make on the back of using that credit? Is it an offset claim, or is it what people are now calling a contribution claim? Are you just saying that you contributed to global mitigation? In which case, a corresponding adjustment would not necessarily be required. But if you are offsetting, a lot of people in this space think a corresponding adjustment would be required. The question I have is what is an offset in the context of a voluntary commitment? I mean, I think we need to get more sophisticated in this whole claim space, which is going to require these voluntary targets to be more sophisticated. It's not really clear in most cases what the near-term target is, how it's being accounted for, the role of carbon markets in it, whether that is compensation or neutralization or any of the rest of it. I think what we know is that we need to provide a really high level of transparency, and that we need to start unpacking these targets a little bit and really understand what's in them in order to be able to distinguish between offsetting and contribution. I don't think that's such an easy distinction. And I think there's going to be a lot of work in that space in the coming months, not least because we're seeing countries lean in on ESG guidance, where the SEC is going to have guidance. The EU is going to have regulations on this. So I think it's going to become, the claim space is going to become a really important space, because we have this pretty sophisticated system of carbon market accounting that we're trying to apply to pretty unsophisticated targets. So the mismatch is creating a lot of this debate.
No, that's great. Thank you, Kelley. Thanks for the clarification and that insight. Ed, I see you very politely raise your hand. Floor is yours, sir.
Thanks, Rene. I just wanted to respond to Kelley's point there, because I thought it was a really good one, actually. It was a point about using a verified emission reduction or a carbon offset in compliance markets. It's the same ton that we're using. It doesn't matter where you use it. We're going to undertake the same activities on the ground to build robust units whereby we can demonstrate that we are physically reducing emissions, and we are measuring the amount of emissions that we're reducing to a degree of certainty such that we can create a usable, fungible unit, a tangible unit with a degree of certainty that you can actually trade that unit. It doesn't matter whether it's in the voluntary market or a compliance market, it's the same unit, right? So the question about corresponding adjustments, I just wanted to make it really clear, it's not an integrity question, because I've seen that in the media a little bit, when it's questioning the environmental integrity about units because they don't have corresponding adjustments. It's absolutely not that. The unit still has integrity. It's an accounting mechanism. It's where you're booking that unit. If you're using it for a purpose which is going to be reported up to the UNFCCC for the global stock take, then it has to be correspondingly adjusted, because a corresponding adjustment is a mechanism to avoid double counting at the UN level to ensure that we're on target to meet the Paris Agreement. I think it's as simple as that. If it's going to be UN reported, it is correspondingly adjusted. If it's not, it doesn't.
I try my best in this debate to stay in the middle, and because I do want to see compromise on this issue. And there's a lot of weight to both sides of the argument. And I think I'd like to stay in a landing zone and have other people join me there, because we need a landing zone on this. I will just say that Ed has expressed the view of many, many people. But from the perspective of the other side of that debate, the problem is that the ton that you're talking about is being reported to the UN. So it's always involved, because it's being reported to the UN as by the host country as a reduction, even if it's not being reported as a carbon credit by the buyer country. So that's where the debate gets more complex. But I do think that Ed has well expressed one side of the argument. I just want to be fair to the other side.
Mm-hmm. Yep. No. I think that's fairly good. So in order to avoid, I guess, focusing exclusively on corresponding adjustments, and I think being fair to the audience, maybe we use this as an opportunity to kind of pivot a little bit. And so going back to something that Ed said earlier, and we're getting some really interesting questions from the audience, so I really appreciate that, and I'll use this as the kind of the impetus. But Ed, you mentioned the piece around the financing side of things in terms of incentivizing private finance to help to scale the emission reduction side of things with regards to nature-based solutions. Do you want to just elaborate on that component? And then I've got a follow-up question, which is coming from Naomi Swickwood from South Pole.
Sure. Yeah. No. Absolutely. As I say, the sort of key hurdles we would see at present coming in, and bearing in mind that the voluntary markets are essentially growing at an exponential growth rate at the moment, albeit from a relatively low base, but it is by definition an exponential growth curve, right? So private sector investment is flooding into this space. There are natural growing pains in this space because the infrastructure, one of the 17 recommendations from the TSVCM was around market infrastructure. It wasn't one that we necessarily ran with as market participants. And now we're feeling those growing pains around the ability to scale up at the rate in which demand has significantly surpassed supply. But really, it's that sort of vague, and I don't want to come back to corresponding adjustments because we just moved away from it, but it is that sort of vague regulatory uncertainty which is precluding significant investment coming into this space. Now, I wouldn't say that's in its entirety blocking private investment. Okay, money is flowing. Where we're seeing the mismatch between demand and supply is that these sorts of projects and programs, there's actually a pretty significant lead time in terms of developing them. You have a socialization period with the government. You have to work very closely with communities in the local environments. You have to ensure that you're adhering to principles of free and prior informed consent. You can't just go and impose a program on a community, right? You have to go and talk to people, understand what are the drivers of deforestation, what are we trying to mitigate, and how we're going to do that, and get alignment with the communities that what you're suggesting you want to do is what they also want to do. That's called consent, which is a key point of FPIC. So with that sort of bearing in mind, that lead time, that sort of moderate supply constraint we're seeing now is what I think is causing the mismatch. So I think money is flowing is what I'm saying, but I think it's going to take a little while for it to switch on at any particular scale.
Okay, I'll open it to the panelists. Do you guys want to comment on that before I jump in with another question? Dirk?
I just have one thing to add to it, and that is that I would encourage more governments to consider use of nature-based credits in their compliance systems, because I think in the places that that's been done, it stimulated a lot more investment flow than
That's a really good point.
Without it. And so California is a great example of that. A large portion of the offset supply there, albeit from domestic US sources, but it's been an important learning ground and an important supplier of credits. It's done some phenomenal things for forestry. I also think the same is true in Colombia, where the tax system recognizes Colombian nature-based offsets. I think we need to see more of those systems that encourage the quantification and the unitization and the proper verification, all of those tools and techniques that that Ed and others have grown up with in the voluntary carbon market that can be hallmarks of compliance system that can actually help both sides. So that's one thing I would encourage in a big way for governments and for corporates that are talking to governments around the world to consider, because this is an important asset class that we need for it to mature more.
I completely agree, and I think that both of those examples that you cited are perfect examples of how that policy direction really provides some certainty, and then effectively unlocks the private markets to really help to achieve scale there. That's probably a really good kind of transition into the question that we're getting from Naomi. The question is, what is the panel's view on of the recent announcement by Gabon on their self-issued units? Are they robust enough for markets? And what additional work is needed under Article 6 to articulate final accounting rules for nature-based solutions, especially for any potential under Article 6.4? Open it up for discussion to any of the panelists. Kelley, you put your hand up, so you go first, please.
No, I think it's a really good question. And Naomi, nice to see you, or see your question in the Q&A. Sorry, Naomi knows more about nature-based solutions than most people.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Given her previous role at Vera, absolutely.
So I feel a little awkward answering a question as if I have greater expertise, but I'll give you my opinion because it's definitely not greater expertise than Naomi. I think, this question of self-issued credits is a question really for 6.2, because 6.4 credits will be certified under 6.4, much like a CDM credit was certified by the UN. So there is a governing body for 6.4, and they have to elaborate a lot of the rules. So we got kind of the high level rules in Glasgow, but we still need a deeper level of clarification on how baselines are determined, how the different measures that can be put in place for permanence. All of those things need further elaboration under 6.4, and that body met for the first time, just last week, the week before, to really start to dig into those rules. So we're going to need to see that before we see credits certified under 6.4. But for self-certification, that really becomes an issue for 6.2, and it's going to be an issue for contracts between the two parties to a contract under 6.2, and subject to all the transparency requirements under 6.2. But I think one of the things that we're seeing is that people are taking instruments designed under the UN and generating credits. But if those instruments weren't designed to be carbon market instruments, they may not address some of the fundamentals. And that's my concern for some of this, is like, there's a difference between something that was created to be results-based finance and something that was created to be carbon credit. When it comes to carbon crediting, we have to address fundamental issues of additionality, measures for permanence, different accounting rules. And I think all of those things need to be in place for us to have a robust market that people trust. And so I would like to make sure that anything generated at a country level has those fundamentals, so that we have a market that is underpinned by trust. And just saying this thing was created in the UNFCCC, if it wasn't created for the purpose of carbon credits, it probably doesn't address some of those fundamentals.
That's a great insight. I see Ed nodding vigorously. Ed, do you want to have a follow-up?
Bravo and here, I'd say, Kelley. Fantastic response. I completely agree. I mean, just to follow on from that, I mean, I won't specifically comment on Gabon, mainly because I've not read the technical documentation, so I don't have an opinion on that. But in terms of Naomi's question around 6.4, firstly, I'd say don't reinvent the wheel. We've got 2 or 3 decades of carbon market experience. So if we're looking at standards around developing nature-based solutions, emission reductions, use the existing work and build on that. That'd be my first point. My second point, I'd move on just to talk more broadly about the concept of units that are either sort of nationally driven or self-certified. So I have the benefit of sitting here in London, where we're currently undergoing a leadership contest because we have a prime minister who has a rather casual relationship with the truth. So if you're looking at self-certified national numbers, they're not always going to be as certain as one might require for a market, would be my first comment. I mean, looking at jurisdictional programs more broadly, Kelley touched on a number of the attributes which are required to create a robust carbon offset that is market ready. And there's a couple of points I would just focus on very specifically, which relate to nationally developed programs. So the key point which concerns us is around permanence. So if you implement a nationally derived program and there's a change in political administration, then how can you demonstrate permanence? How can you ensure that those policies are not going to change on a sort of 4, 5, 6 year cycle, right? Maybe less relevant in Gabon, as the leader of Gabon has had the same surname for the last 6 decades. So you probably have some sort of certainty around permanence there, but that's a different issue. With regards to FPIC, which I mentioned earlier, free and prior informed consent, if you're implementing something at the subnational, so state level or national scale, you can have a number of different stakeholders and different forms of land tenure, different vested interests. How are you going to ensure that what you're implementing is consented by all within that landscape? It's challenging, if not impossible, to implement at that scale these sorts of programs, I would suggest. It's far easier at an individual parcel of particular type of land tenure scale, because you can understand what's going on at that more manageable, palatable scale. And then my last point just on this before I hand over to someone else is on at that scale, at the national scale, is around causality, attribution of causality. So what my issue there is that, so an example would be in Indonesia, for instance. In Indonesia, we're coming to the tail end of the dry season this season, and it has rained throughout the whole dry season. So if you perform, i.e. there's less deforestation one year just because it rained a lot, does that mean you should be able to derive an emission reduction, a carbon credit? And is that a unit that you would want to offset something with? I don't think it is. I'll stop there.
And I think I share a lot of the sentiments here that, first of all, it's relatively recent news and we need to learn and understand more about it. But I'm kind of with Kelley. I don't know that it follows the traditional, that it has all the attributes. Those credits have all the attributes of what we come to expect in voluntary carbon markets. When I think about how would it measure up against core carbon principles, for example, that the ICVCM is working on, or even at PROA's, assessment of standards, I'm not sure that it's got all of those attributes of independent verification and kind of the permanence features and sort of quality assurance provisions. But again, we need to learn more about it. And
sure,
I would love to see something ripen in that space that does inspire investor confidence. And part of that, I do think, is wrapped up in the 6.2 world of, is any government going to recognize Gabon issued units for a compliance purpose? If they did, that might increase the confidence for others.
Okay, that's a really good point. Sorry, Kelley, you jump in. Go for it.
Just 2 fingers on this. I think, I'm definitely not commenting specifically on Gabon because I don't know enough to. But I think what we're all saying is that there are these sort of fundamentals that we have to have in place, and so I haven't seen the details of what's happening, but generally I think it's a great idea for governments to be involved in what's happening in carbon crediting. It's just we have to have that plus these other fundamentals to have a trusted market, and that may be the case in Gabon. I just don't know.
That's a good point. Obviously, the intention, I guess, of that question, I don't want to speak for Naomi, but obviously it's just to highlight the kind of the broader scope here around these country-based credits. Another question that comes to mind, and I'm taking some inspiration from the audience questions, which are fantastic, but just kind of picking up from this thread. I mean, recently another kind of media story was around the Democratic Republic of Congo and the country's kind of opening up their forests to oil exploration effectively, right? And essentially, reading the various articles on this topic, it was evident that there essentially was frustration at the government level, because effectively and Kelley, to an earlier point that you made around the financing side of things, that within Green Climate Fund, whatever it might be, some country specific financing had not materialized to the tune that they were expecting, and so essentially they're looking at effectively their sovereignty and looking to monetize the wealth of commodities effectively under their soil. But effectively that conflicts with basically today's topic, and really what we're all sort of passionate about is really the protection of native forests, because of the broader, not only just the carbon sequestration piece, but the broader ecosystem benefits, right? And so how do you see those sorts of things interplaying within what we're discussing today? I'll open up to any of you. Who wants to jump in first?
I mean, I would just respond immediately, Rene, by saying that, that's entirely endorsing my point around permanence, that if you had a private sector actor that had robust contracts for a long period of time to manage that area forest for conservation and restoration, that could survive changes in political administration, and the government was receiving its fair share of revenue at a sensible price, such that you're out-competing alternative land uses, then you would have prevented that from happening. So there is one concern that's being mooted in the market at the moment, which is, whilst there's a current blip in the market during the sort of quiet summer months and various other things going on, as carbon prices come down, then alternative land uses, as other commodity prices are significantly increasing, the opportunity cost means that the landowner is going to suggest, well, I should go for this rather than that. I mean, it's a very short approach if you think a longer term trajectory of income certainty, what you can do with that piece of land over a period of time. But it is something that is a concern when you're trying to outcompete other land uses, and DRC is a perfect example of that. They've just said, okay, oil prices is here, you're not paying me for the carbon, so this is what we're going to do.
Yep. Yeah, interesting. All right, I'm just conscious of time. We've got a 15 minutes, so let's do. I'm going to challenge the panelists really here to a speed round with regards to some of the questions. I'll do my best. So, audience, thanks so much for the questions so far. Sam Walker asks, Rene, at the outset you mentioned the attractiveness to the buyers of co-benefits. Perhaps the panel could reflect on some of the specifics where they see the value of multiple attributes going in the future. This kind of resonates within this kind of quality debate. Kelley, do you want to kind of provide some of your views around the co-benefit side and how we ought to value those?
Yeah, I mean, I think this we have to not only value them, but we need to ensure that they are looked after in the governance and in the crediting standards, right? I mean, I think carbon markets are already there to sort of address a market failure. But what we're seeing is they've created market failures of their own if we don't value some of these co-benefits, but also some of the impacts that aren't necessarily climate impacts. And I think Ed spoke to that earlier, some of the sustainable development, the impacts on, the impacts and involvement and benefit of and co-ownership of Indigenous people and local communities is huge and something that we need to be better at. And I think we're all trying to be better at it. And, just to go back to your previous question, I think also because we're not looking at all these impacts and because there is room for improvement, one of the frustrations of host countries is that the price is too low, right? The conditions are too high and the price is too low. It's a really age-old development finance debate. We've got these sort of rich country rules that we're imposing on developing countries and then not offering them a price that's commensurate. And I think, in the articles I did read about Gabon, that's one of the frustrations and one of the reasons they're taking it into their own hands. And I think it's a really important dynamic to address. We saw that also with Tosi's comments about DRC. There's a frustration that the developed world aren't potentially meeting their NDC promises and their finance promises, and then also at the same time imposing these really strict rules in terms of carbon credits, but not offering a great price. So we have to address that balance. We really do.
Yeah, no, I think I completely agree with you on that note. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of go to the next question, and inspired by Patty Gourlay. So Patty, thanks for the question. It says here, how have ratings agencies, and I'm going to paraphrase this question effectively, transform the market, really, given that effectively they're reviewing projects that have already undergone monitoring, reporting, verification at the various standards, and have been issued at those registries. Ed, I'm going to give that one to you, given that you have a biased view, obviously, as a project developer. I'd love to hear it. Have you seen the world sort of transform with the evolution of project ratings?
I will come with my very biased point of view. We've been crying out for ratings agencies in this space for the last decade, and I'll tell you why. There are some definitive quantitative elements of designing a project, and there's some qualitative elements of designing a project. Some of these elements can be relatively subjective, and there are differing qualities of projects out there. Whether it's a project that's either arguably more or less additional, whether it's a project that is in a relatively remote space compared to someone that's really tending to a huge population, has a huge amount of social development aspects. It could be a project that's focused on the last remaining type of forest, which is about to go extinct. So it's a massive biodiversity conservation area. All of these different elements ascribe value to the project, and these ratings agencies are trying to enable the untrained eye to differentiate between them. So I think they provide an incredibly important service in the market.
Yeah, agreed. And I'll open it up. Kelley, you were nodding vigorously. Dirk, do you want to comment on that as well?
I think not just the rating agencies, but what the work of the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets is trying to create this threshold standard. Because what we're seeing now is, really is big companies having to put a massive amount of resource into the due diligence to purchase carbon credits. And if we could make that easier, it would just create an efficiency that would be really important. Like if people could readily understand the difference between all these carbon credits, it would be hugely important. I have to say though, there are aspects of carbon crediting that are just policy choices for companies. Like, do you want to invest in nature? Do you want to invest in smaller local community projects that benefit mainly women? Do you want to invest in energy transformation? Those are policy choices, and they're not about quality. But I do think things like these threshold standards or potentially these ratings are going to create an efficiency that's going to be necessary to scale the market to provide the private sector capital that we really need.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Dirk?
From my vantage point, just glad to see the topic reemerging, because in the heyday of the CDM, we had quite a lot of rating potential. Entity, I think, based there in Singapore. And with the market collapse, it all went away, right? And so now that capacity is being rebuilt. But I'm kind of same place as Kelley. I don't think it's a substitute for the threshold standard. I think it's potentially a valuable thing for buyers and sellers in the market to have some independent benchmarks of quality integrity in terms of specific project. But I think the threshold standard is still incredibly valuable.
Yeah, great. And I think I'll just build on that. I think, obviously, just tying what you guys have just commented on is the additional layer of objectivity that the ratings agencies provide. What I will say, to kind of just for full transparency in the market, I think a lot of them are still in their genesis, right? So we don't see yet convergence across the various different agencies around all the projects. There's still some outliers, and so that is underlying the different methodologies. But I think that they share some commonality, and then this is kind of the last question I think we might have time for. Maybe we'll have time for another, which is, it's interesting to me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, guys, on the types of tools that the ratings agencies are utilizing, which is effectively remote sensing, or heavily led by remote sensing, and then artificial intelligence, machine learning applied to those remote sensing data sets. So looking at, for example, satellite information, drone information, LiDAR, etc., and effectively utilizing that to get a picture in terms of the carbon sequestration potential of those projects. My question is actually whether those types of technologies are applicable to the actual monitoring, reporting, and verification side of things, and whether you see potential there for essentially creating a higher throughput of projects in the pipeline. Does that make sense? I see Ed kind of going like this. Ed, is that a good? Have I hit a nerve?
It sounds like one for me, because we're a developer. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Rene. The science is continually moving forward as we enable ourselves to improve the accuracy of how you measure these types of carbon fluxes, how you measure the biomass, et cetera, et cetera. The methodologies need to keep up to try and ensure that they require you to use the best available science or the best available cost-efficient science, so that we don't outprice smaller developers as well. So you've got to bear that in mind. But yeah,
of course.
These are really important. We're not at a stage yet where I suggest that you can monitor, report, and verify emission reductions at a national level, the degree of integrity that would enable you to create a tradable unit. But we're not far off of it. It's something that will come. So we are. And also, you mentioned about sort of remote sensing and LiDAR, and all of these different techniques still do need to be calibrated by,
Of course, bigger data sets.
Going down on the ground, measuring trees, diameter of breast height. Don't forget that.
Yep.
Lots of jobs for lots of communities to go out and measure trees.
Yeah, and that's definitely a very important point. And I think also in terms of the calibration piece, there's obviously a need for having access to broad data sets around historical forest monitoring in the United States, for example, and in other jurisdictions, so that they can better refine their machine learning processes. I'm just curious, Ed, on that one, if you'll indulge me. Obviously the current default right now for project monitoring and verification requires this physical sampling, right? So literally people going to the forest and with tape measures, measuring the diameter of trees and counting effectively within sample sizes and sample lots across the project area. Given the pandemic restricted effectively movement and travel to a lot of these countries and for people globally, right? We couldn't travel. We saw significant delays emerge in terms of that project pipeline, certainly within the major standards. How do you see those remote sensing tools kind of being used in unison or collaboratively with the physical kind of measurement science side of things to alleviate those types of gaps in the market and or help to provide within the triannual kind of measurement piece a more sort of accurate data set around the project activity, let's say closer to real time?
Oh, absolutely. Look, Rene, you're absolutely right. There was an issue around freedom of movement orders, inability to get into countries, unable to take the ground measurements, but also the inability to get an auditor of validation verification.
That's a huge point. Yeah.
Able to quantify your work and audit it and enable you to generate new units. So there's a huge build-up within all of the leading carbon accounting standards right now, which they are all hiring up to try and alleviate as the market has grown, and there's been to alleviate that bottleneck. But there's always going to be a requirement to go and calibrate these models. I mean, the technology is moving forward. You don't really want to automate the entire thing because there's a lot of people living around the community. Pretty good job.
Of course.
So I'd suggest continue to use people on the ground to do this. But yeah, the technology is moving forward and it's really important.
Good. Cool. All right. We're looking at the clock. I think we have maybe time for some final thoughts and kind of opinions. Let's just go around the panel. Kelley, can I begin with you? What are some of your final kind of thoughts and what would you like to kind of contribute?
No, I mean, I just thank you very much for having me today. It's been a great discussion. The questions are amazing. I wish we had been able to address all of them. And
definitely,
I think
we've had some great ones. We'll do our best to answer as many of them following the panel. So I'll circulate that to the panelists.
So thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for joining us, Kelley. We really appreciate your valuable insights. Dirk, what are your thoughts? I mean, you're the eternal optimist, right? And in terms of how do you see things moving forward here? I'd love to get your take.
We're having this conversation right after a big week in the United States, where we're finally getting a large federal program to support climate action. And you look at
Very
that,
much so.
it's like, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment into climate mitigation. It's so encouraging. And yet it only gets you to minus 40%, and we've pledged minus 50. So there is still a role for private actors to leverage that federal money, but also the U.S. is gonna have to top it up somehow. And I think voluntary action can be part of that. We need to be creative about thinking about how that works. But I think it's not an isolated story. Ed talked earlier about the global stock take and what that's going to be. And one thing we don't want it to be, if you're a hard-nosed business person that's committed to market solutions, you don't want blind ambition, where they just come in and pick a number and throw it up in the air and say, yeah, that's it, with no plan of how to achieve it. So now I think all of the focus is shifting back to how are you going to achieve it and how can Article 6 help you? So I hope that those in the business and financial community that are watching this can think about, like, this is all opportunity to be a collaborator in the effort. And certainly that's how we at IETA view it is. We're just trying to be partners in this massive mobilization that needs to happen.
Great. Well said, Dirk. Ed, do you venture into commenting after that amazing comment from Dirk?
Yeah,
You're a brave man if you do.
My final thoughts. I'm actually going to quote my dear friend Erin, who once described global carbon markets as a circular firing squad. So this is my plea to the market is that rather than arguing about whether you're doing good is better than the way that I'm doing good, whether it's private, public finance, government-led or not, correspondingly adjusted or not, rather than throwing mud at each other, let's all point in the same direction and do it all, because we're still way, way behind.
That's a great point. And I think on that note, let's end on collaboration and on effectively moving the needle forward together. So thank you very much. Really appreciate you all for joining. I'm sure the audience got a lot of value from that. So thank you so much for the time. And with that, we'll wrap it up. Obviously, we'll have some further updates with regards to the next webinar and look forward to seeing you all then. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Thanks,